time how you choose to do that maybe ask some questions or basically you talking to us up for use it if you like.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. What is that, friends? I think critical to understanding this was the context in which it sits, and that is the revelations by Edward Snowden of massive surveillance engaged in by the GCSB's main partner, and that is the American National Security Agency. And it's now clear that the NSA considers the communications, the private communications of any government in the world fair game, including the communications of the Russian government, China, and even close allies like France and Germany. And these governments have got very upset at being spied upon in this way. You just need to look at the headlines in the paper today, for example. US spying claims may jeopardise trade deal. That's the EU-American trade deal. Unholy row erupts after spying claims. And the French President, François Hollande, says, we ask that this immediately stop. There can be no negotiations or deal making until we've obtained these safeguards. So it's directly affecting those trade negotiations. Our problem here is that we're also upsetting friendly governments because the GCSB is helping the NSA gather information on them. The GCSB hands over to the NSA the information it gathers on millions of international phone calls passing through the communication satellites targeted by the Satellite Dishes Act by HOPA. And it is particularly apparent from the Snowden revelations that the NSA is interested in Chinese government communications, and that it will be filtering, that is, the NSA will be filtering the international phone data gathered by HOPA and passed on to the NSA will be filtered, particularly to look at Chinese communications. And what we have to face up to as a nation is that New Zealand helping the NSA spy on China, which it is doing, is not in our national interest. It is not in our national interest to spy on China, our biggest trading partner, and we're dreaming if we think there won't be a cost somewhere down the line. The Chinese Foreign Ministry responded very angrily to the Snowden revelations of extensing NSA spying on Chinese computers and mobile phone networks, and it is ironical that we are helping to spy on China supposedly in the name of national security, the term national security is in this bill, but actually we're seriously undermining our own national security. And if there is some form of trade or investment kickback from China, which eventually there will, then the GCSB's complicity in US spying on China can be called sabotage. That's another thing that comes up in the intelligence legislation, but it will be sabotage committed by the government by spying on China's sabotage of our own economy. This is what the real world's about, and the just blindness to think that somehow China won't notice this or do anything about it. And I think that before we pass such legislation as this, reinforcing the powers of the GCSB, we need to have an open and public discussion on these matters. The government just can't continue to hide behind a smoke screen that I saw in my 12 years in Parliament. Whenever something is brought up for discussion, we can't comment on that. It's a national security matter. For example, when I asked Colin Clark and John Key how much Waihopai costs annually to run, I was told I can't tell you. It's a national security issue, and clearly it's a genuine taxpayer's issue. It's part of the budget that the NSA pays for. Because underneath, I think the government, the Labor Labor-led government and now the national government, want to avoid any serious discussion about the GCSB's main asset, that is Waihopai. And let's be clear that Waihopai wasn't constructed in the 1980s to catch terrorists. There wasn't any war in Terabini. It was to spy on governments. That is why today's news is so relevant. in the 90s it was more spying on Japanese government communications, now it would be more likely to be China. And President Obama is sort of unashamed about this really. He said a couple of days ago that to spy on communications of other Western governments was just helping the United States understand the world better. When in fact we all know, and the European governments and the Chinese government knows it's to get an edge for US interests in trade negotiations, helping to get the TPPA through, perhaps winning contracts to US companies in a competitive situation, etc. And that's why the EU is laying down the law against it. So we need a public discussion to determine what is actually the cost-benefit ratio of participating in this Five Eyes network led by the NSA that's spying on the rest of the world, the governments of the rest of the world. And it does generate hostility towards us. When I was on a parliamentary delegation with Phil Locke, Prime Minister of New Caledonia, in 2000, we were berated by the New Caledonian government for using Waihopai to spy on them. And they were quite right. Waihopai was being used to spy on them, and they were right to be upset about it. It wasn't helping our relations with New Caledonia or other Pacific countries. Now, what do we gain? Well, we may gain a few tidbits of information from the Five Eyes network, although we don't really know, it's all behind closed doors. But I can't imagine that there is any great gain for us, and we're a very open society ourselves, we have nothing much to hide. There is some evidence that the GCSB activity is not really opening up any serious inquiry on criminality. The Rebecca Kitteridge report mentions 55 warranted SAS operations over a 10-year period that the GCSB assisted on, and that's one of the things made out in this bill. But Ian Fletcher, the GCSB director, said that not one single case did legal proceedings follow, whereas if you look at the police stats, even for the last year, the last figures I could come up with was 25 warrants, 45 arrests under the Crimes Act, and similar figures under the Misuse of Drugs Act. So it doesn't appear that the SAS backed up by the GCSB is spying on real criminality, because in decades really they haven't come up with a case where they've successfully launched a prosecution. Even one case these days launched against Bill Such turned out to be a failure. So all these things need to be discussed, and the relative impact on the intrusion on our privacy versus any gain in terms of detecting crime. All this needs to be discussed very openly. And I don't want to take up all my time, you've given me 15 minutes, so I'll leave it there for questions.
So, Dave, can I just ask you one question? I wouldn't want to imply that doesn't GCSB gather information on China, but do you believe the Chinese gather any information about New Zealand?
I think if the Chinese are gathering information on New Zealand, it would primarily to get hold of what the Five Eyes are doing, because they know the Five Eyes are spying on them. New Zealand is a smaller, possibly less sophisticated player, so the Chinese might be trying to hook into the GCSB to get some of the Five Eyes information. But if we weren't part of the Five Eyes, that wouldn't be the case. Now,
so in terms of communications between individual New Zealanders, not one security, various agencies are of no real concern, they would have no real interest in doing that.
Yeah, I think we're in a bit of a different situation from some other countries too, because we're a very open society. We need government, and you just need to go to the Beehive website to find out everything that you say, and the Parliament website to find out everything the other MPs say. You've got Hansard, you've got direct broadcast, our economy's pretty open. If anyone wants to know about our defence force, you can find out in 5 minutes by going to the defence website. What are the secrets that the Chinese would be interested in?
Right. So on that basis then, do you not agree with the Green Party and the Labour Party believe that Huawei are spying on individual New Zealanders in New Zealand who should or should not be allowed to operate in New Zealand? Because as you said, that could be individual communications of which there would be no great benefit.
Yeah, I haven't seen any evidence that Huawei is spying on New Zealand.
So you agree?
I
It's a spirit of
think that it's unlikely, to be honest, because when you've got a multi-billion-dollar international company, they're trying to protect their brand. So I don't think they would be want to get caught spying unnecessarily on the communications of people in other countries.
Well, yours was.
Yeah, just the first question. I mean, just following on from that, do you think that some of our companies, our strategic companies in New Zealand, might be spied upon for intellectual property? Some of our high-tech companies, you don't think that that might be valuable for overseas countries to try and obtain?
It's possible, although the high-tech companies would probably be the ones best able to protect themselves from hacking or detect if hacking took place. But
So you think there's no
a lot of the stuff,
GCSB
even the frontier stuff, they auction milk now, it's out in the open much more. Sorry, what was that?
Just following on from that, so in a sense you don't believe that there's a real need to provide for, say, that our intelligence agencies to keep an eye on the type of gatherers spying on some of our companies that might result in our IP being stolen, economic secrets being taken, anything like. You don't think that's a risk?
Well, it's good to have a cyber security capacity. That capacity could be run by the police. The police are already involved in cyber security. One of the big unknowns in this debate is what extra technology the GCSB brings to the party in terms of cyber security protection. What I'm saying more is that being in the Five Eyes is actually more a downside than an upside. Might be a few tidbits of information, maybe marginally help in cyber security, but the downside in terms of annoying all the countries in the world other than the other four in the Five Eyes is a much greater danger, and particularly when we're a trading company that trades in very different markets, and most of those markets are not too enamoured of the Five Eyes spying on the rest of the world.
At the time you were in Parliament, did you receive information that was provided by the Five Eyes? Did you receive documents that were supported by the Five Eyes?
I didn't see Five Eyes documents.
So
No, hold on. There's one document I did see. And that is a memorandum. It was a whistleblower called Catherine Gunn, disclosed it in early 2003. And she was working with the GCHQ, partner agency to the GCSB. And it was a memorandum from Frank Kozer, who was an official of the NSA, calling for a surge of interceptions of the communications of dissident members of the Security Council. This is just the period leading up to the Iraq War. And the countries like Chile and Mexico and Pakistan were sort of not knowing whether to go with the US line of supporting the war or against. And this was tasked for the Five Eyes. So what that meant, that memorandum meant, was that New Zealand, even though under Helen Clark we were trying to keep out of the war, through Five Eyes, the GCSB was spying on the communications of friendly nations like Chile and Mexico to help get America into the war with UN backing. So one of the problems with the Five Eyes is that our foreign policy is not identical with that of other countries in it, particularly America, over questions like Iraq and other questions. So the Five Eyes network is a very integrated network with complete sharing of all data. The Five Eyes network is used primarily for American foreign policy interests, which are not the same as our own. So that undermines New Zealand having an independent foreign policy.
It isn't true that in your entire time being a member of Parliament, you actually never saw documents that were actually supplied by the Five Eyes. So you actually can't say whether provide information that was useful to our defence forces and our military people serving overseas with potential threats that we're here in New Zealand. That's your view that you formed it, doesn't do that, but you can't actually draw.
Yeah, I think that's one of the issues too, that there should be much more openness about particularly the results, the successes of the GCSB and its relationship to the Five Eyes and its currently the situation I see in Britain. They're now going to a situation where the intelligence security there is going to be able to interrogate the heads of the intelligence agencies. We should have a situation where there's public hearings here and they have it in America. or the heads of intelligence agencies are interrogated by committees like this in public view. We'd have much more confidence, and you know, if you have a different viewpoint from me on intelligence service, we'll be able to settle that if there was much more information made available, much more open.
Can I just go back to one question?
Okay.
Well, you don't answer my question and you cut in, so I'm just going to finish this question.
I'm just trying to get this.
I know. I mean, Huawei was something that the Prime Minister mentioned. You noted that it probably wasn't a problem or a threat or any sort of issue. Yet the United States, Canada, the UK has used them, but they spent $26 million trying to reverse it, and Australia have all cut Huawei out of their intelligence services. Do you think there's a pattern there, and do you think that perhaps we were wise to go ahead and allow them to come in here, and now are starting to think about some restrictions?
Well, I suspect that Britain and America, for their own geopolitical reasons, don't want how, you know, they aren't too keen on big Chinese multinationals sort of pushing aside some American firms. So I think that's more what's operating there. It's more of a great protectionist.
So, just on the question as to the original GCSB legislation passed in 2003, you were present at the time. Since then, there's been some debate as to whether that legislation specifically prevented the GCSB from spying on New Zealand. And I know that you were one of those who was present during that debate. And I just, after your impressions, and just to jog your memory, I just got a very short quote here during the debate where a government, a National Party member said, that there are some interesting submissioners, people who are quite bent on conspiracy theories and seem to think that all the GCSB ever does is listen in on New Zealanders' telephone calls, which is of course expressly prohibited. This is a government member. The Bureau is not allowed to listen in on New Zealanders. Now the author of that statement was Tony Ryder in the debate in the House, where he was very, very clear in the original legislation that the GCSB was not allowed to listen in on New Zealanders' communications. Now, was that your recollection of the debate at the time as well?
Yeah, that was a very good speech, I think. And certainly the speeches I made, the speeches Labor MPs made, it was Labor government at the time, they all repeated over and over that foreigners wouldn't be, New Zealanders wouldn't be spied on because of foreign intelligence. And the same debate took place in America.
Were you surprised later when members who were involved in that debate said, oh, there's some ambiguity as to whether the GCSB was spying?
There's two things. A, there wasn't ambiguity as far as I could see. And the other thing is when courts, this is why it's never gone to a court and instead come to legislation, when courts rule, they go back to the debates in Parliament and interpret the legislation in terms of what the intention of the government and the Parliament was. And any judge looking at those debates, and all the debates since, in the years since 2003, would come to the conclusion that New Zealanders were not to be spied on. Absolutely. And one of the points I did raise at the time in those debates was that the problem with phone calls, particularly the international phone calls intercepted by Hobart, where there are grants involved, is most phone calls, international phone calls and other calls, don't come with passports attached. So it's very hard when an agency is intercepting them to work out whether New Zealand are those people. Plus, as is part of the debate in the United States currently, the NSA says, no, we're not spying on Americans, but Americans communicate with foreigners, and so their calls are being intercepted in that way.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Locke. Okay, prior to